Hello and welcome to the Association for Coaching podcast. My name's Darren Robson and I'm your host for this health and wellbeing series. Today I'm joined by Yannick. So Yannick, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it's completely unscripted. I have no idea where we're going to go. So let's start off firstly by, who are you? So introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name is Yannick Jacob. I grew up Jacob because I'm German. I've been in the UK for about 16 years now, I think. Interested in studying the mind, having figured out quite early that I need a lot of variety in my life. So I figured people are never going to get boring. And so I did that and then fell into positive psychology, which is part of why I'm here. Because I saw it up on the curriculum when I was at uni in my third year. And I thought, positive psychology? What's that? I read a bit around it, literally went to the library and picked up the first introductory textbook. And I thought, this is amazing. The science of what's right with people, building on resources, figuring out what happiness is, looking at not what problems are, but what resources we can build on and what generally is going well. I'm like, that's great, that's new. And through that, I became interested in coaching. So I was interested in having deep conversations with people. But it drew me into coaching because the science from coaching often comes from positive psychology, because we look at optimal human functioning and health and well-being. So they're perfect partners. Coaching is often seen as the applied arm of the science of positive psychology. So I was kind of all over that. I found at some point that a lot of positive psychologists were a little bit too positive for my taste. You know, it was never meant to be a science that stands on its own feet and has its own thing going. It was always meant to complete psychology as a whole, because there was just something missing. We didn't really do any research into what's right with people. Then I switched to the other side and I did a master's in existential coaching. So now I found something that people can relate to, that is tangible, that is not denying that life is really hard oftentimes. But I could integrate all of these amazing tools and the knowledge and the conceptualizations from positive psychology. So now I'm kind of a positive existential coach. I have a lot of other arms. I'm a bit of a multi-potentialite. I do some mediation, which is conflict resolution. I do these happiness workshops. I train and supervise a lot of coaches and bring that all together. My main thing is helping people think, and I'm trying to inspire the world to embrace their human condition and look at life with open eyes, but with a positive mindset. That's what I bring to my clients.
Wonderful. And I love that phrase, positive existentialism. So why don't you just unpack that a bit more for us? So what have you learned about existentialism and how it's a good bedfellow with positive psychology? Unpick that for us, because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and it doesn't make intuitive sense if you've just have a little bit of an understanding, or if you've heard the term existential, usually in relation to an existential crisis or an existential threat. So the philosophy behind existentialism, people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Heidegger and Buber and Sartre, they used philosophy as a means of inquiry. Science measures and observes generally. And before we had good measurements and ways of observing and getting good data, we used philosophy to figure out things that we don't know about and that we can't measure. Things like, at the heart of existentialism is the question, what does it mean to be? What does it mean to exist? What is it about being alive and in the world with others? Causes certain anxieties just to be alive. It's a difficult thing to be human, because we have all these inner conflicts and conflicting needs and wants. We want to be our own individual, but we want to belong. We crave certainty, but at the same time, nothing's really certain. We want to belong, but we feel isolated. There's the saying that we're born alone, we die alone. And when we are still and when we do nothing, we get itchy and things come up. We're craving meaning and purpose in a world where we can only have faith that there is meaning and purpose overall. We need to create meaning in our lives. It's not necessarily given, even though everybody gives us meaning. But is that really true? Can we really know that? So these are some of these big questions. Who am I? What do I do with my life? How can I be happy? And this is where some of the meeting points merge. Because one of the big questions is definitely, how can I live a good life? And how can I be happy? Whether you want to triple your income, or you want to live a life of meaning and purpose, or you just want to go have some fun. These are all different ideas of how you can live a good life. But nobody tells you, there's no one size fits all. Everybody tells you how to be happy, but really you need to find that out yourself. So what I've noticed over the years is that pretty much 100% of my clients come in with something that they want to work on in their coaching. And if you follow that up or down or further down the line and you look for the higher order goal, why do you want to lose the weight? Why do you want the money? Why do you want the relationship? And at the end of that, always, in my experience, is some form of happiness, some form of psychological well-being or flourishing based on the popular well-being theories that come from positive psychology. So I realized everybody wants to be happy or better in some way or another. And I could use the frameworks and the tools and the interventions from positive psychology to either inform my questioning or give me clear processes and methodologies on how I can help somebody move towards that form of happiness that they desire.
Wonderful. It's fantastic. It's obviously you've got an amazing command of the subject areas, but you can really hear that it's linked to your own personal philosophy that has been shaped through your experiences, and you're bringing that academic rigor, but also lived experience with it. I can hear it in the way that you're demonstrating that. So somebody working with you, what's the experience of working with you? How do you get them to ask those deeper questions of themselves? What do you do?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because in reality, I never know who's going to come to my space, who's going to approach me with and what they approach me with, because everybody's super unique. And while there are certainly some tendencies in terms of like people start asking themselves those questions and then they seek out an existential coach. So that's where my niching went, even though it's difficult to niche existential coaching, even positive psychology coaching, because what's the demographic is people who want to be happy, which we established is pretty much everybody. And people who are in the world with others is also everybody. So demographic niching didn't really work that well. But as soon as I resonated so strongly with the positive existential terrain, people started finding me because I talk about positive existential stuff, or I talk about existential stuff in a positive way. So a lot of people find me because they already ask themselves big questions. I think it's difficult for me to imagine that you haven't at some point asked yourself, what am I doing here? What am I doing with my life? Where's this career taking me? Why am I in this relationship? Who am I without my job and without my relationship? And in the past year, if you listen to this many years from now, we were living in 2021 and we're coming out of a year of pandemic. A lot of people have been forced to ask big questions, such as, who am I without my job? Or perhaps your whole industry has collapsed. The events industry has been in shambles. A lot of my friends work in the events industry, and I could hear all of those questions. All of a sudden you're sitting at home and you've got nothing to do. Like before, you got your status and your relationships and your passion and your good feelings and the money that helps you live and breathe. All of that was gone. So who are you when you're sitting on your couch? And people who want to switch careers, or they experience that over time, they kind of lost their passion for what they do, or the passion for their partner, or the passion for life itself. In any kind of strength of that feeling, people start asking questions. And even if people ask small questions, I'm not so satisfied. I think I want to go for this promotion or for that promotion, or I've had this fight with my manager or my wife or my husband or my kids. The smaller questions can usually underneath is a bigger question. So I found that these existential concerns, they tend to be there already. And when people come to the coaching space with whatever it is, it's helpful to listen to what's underneath. You might not talk about the big questions in your coaching space. They might not be as relevant, but I get to hear them. And if they turn up a couple of times, I usually feed them back, because I think dealing with the big questions, having thought about the big questions, is a major pillar for health and well-being, because you will, and this is one of the tenets of existentialism, you will face the existential givens, as we call them, the crisis of meaning and the crisis of relationships, not knowing certainty, having to make extremely difficult choices, being in a dilemma. All of these things you will face. It's just a matter of time. Nobody escapes death. Everybody will face death at some point, even if it's your own. There will be somebody close at some point. So I think having thought about that before builds what I call existential resilience. You can bounce back quicker from when those big questions hit you in the face or poke you a little bit. Well, if you have thought about it beforehand, and you can do that with a coach while you're still okay, while you're not in a deep crisis, then chances are you either get out of the crisis quicker, or maybe you don't really fall. It just kind of shakes you a little bit.
Wonderful. I really love the phrase you've just shared and some of what you've shared about the existential givens. So I've never heard that phrase before. Where does that come from, and where can people find out more about the existential givens, other than obviously contacting you, which is a good place, a good source? But where can people find out about existential givens?
Yeah, so The existential givens is the only thing that all the existential thinkers agree on, which I kind of like about existentialism, because there is no Freud, there is no leading figure, there is no thought leader. Søren Kierkegaard is one, he was the first to actually wrote about this kind of stuff. Sartre was perhaps the most popular because he wrote so many plays about it. Heidegger was probably the most brainy and the most dense book, Being and Time, ever written, I think. It's the kind of book where you read sentences or paragraphs like 15 times and you still don't have a clue what's going on. You really have to work it. So all of these people, Yalom is one of perhaps the most famous name and easy to read name. He's a fantastic writer, Irvin D. Yalom, Yalom. He wrote a book called Existential Psychotherapy, and he sums up the givens there, the four. And he's a good writer. He's also written a couple of books where he tells stories from his psychotherapy practice. He's an existential psychotherapist, and he just knows how to tell stories. So all these givens will be there in a really nice and tangible form and engaging in its storytelling. The more academic of you might want to look into the 1980s book, Existential Psychotherapy. So I would recommend Yalom, but all the existential thinkers, they talk about the things, the aspects of life that we cannot avoid unless we stop being human, or we stop living, or we start distracting ourselves on a constant basis, which is, I think, what we see often, not just with my clients, but with my friends and often with myself. We sit there and there's so much entertainment available at a press of a button. People go crazy when the internet goes down. And I think that's why they sit in the stillness and the existential thoughts come up. Who am I if I'm not doing something? Having time to think. There was a brilliant experiment in the positive psychology realm at some point that asked people to rate what they would pay to avoid, or how much they would pay to avoid. And so then they selected the people who said they would pay to avoid an electric shock. And they put them in a room with the only instruction to say, please do nothing, sit with your thoughts for, I think it was 15 minutes. And also, here's a button that gives you an electric shock, which you can, if you want to, press, but you obviously don't have to, but it's just there. And I think it was something around 80% of people shocked themselves rather than sit with their thoughts in stillness. And that's fascinating to me.
I mean, unprompted. So I was interviewing another couple of people the other day, and one of them is a clinical psychologist, and she mentioned that study. And I think that the only distinction between the story you've shared and what she shared was that I think 75-80% were men would do it, and I think it was about 23 to 25% the women actually electrocuted. So there is that only subtle difference, but I was fascinated by it. So listen out for that podcast because we pick into that study. So unprompted, you've mentioned it. Fascinating. So the other thing that, as you were talking earlier, is you talked about some of the paradoxes in life. And also as you've been talking, man's search for meaning was flowing into me as I was listening to you. And purpose, that sense of purpose. So how do you help people to understand the paradoxical nature of life? And how do you get them more in tune with their purpose to then get themselves into happiness and hopefully health and well-being as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you understand paradox? Like, what's the sound of a one hand clapping, right? It's because the essence of paradox is that it's so difficult to put together because it's both and. And so it's really difficult to wrap your head around it. And it took me a while throughout my studies and throughout life. I think you need to sit with that for a little bit. And what we can do is, first of all, as coaches, we can put it on the table. We can reflect back what we're hearing. And if there's a dilemma, sometimes it's helpful to point out that seems to be a dilemma. There's two conflicting things that both exist at the same time. How do we sit? It's really difficult to sit with. And I think the first thing is to acknowledge that this is happening right now. And that's okay. It doesn't feel good, but I think it's much better to sit with it rather than to try and create some false sense of peace or harmony, because we naturally crave harmony. We want things to make sense. We want things to align. We want things to be smooth. We don't want a dilemma to figure out because it doesn't sit with our craving for harmony. If we're presented with two things that are conflicting, but they're both there, there's two choices we have to make, and they're both good, equally good, or they're both equally bad. And we're just going to have to choose one. It's just going to be different. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just different. So it's a dilemma. We have fallen in love with two people. I mean, some might argue that's not possible, but I think that's possible. You can fall in love with two people and then you're in a dilemma. What are you going to do? And people face those kind of decisions all the time. They don't really talk about it. Somebody's in a marriage and then they fall in love with somebody else. Maybe they've fallen out of love, but they're committed to the kids and the marriage and the family. So now they're committed, but also in love with somebody else. And you can't have both at the same time. Many people have tried. Usually it doesn't work. So I think the natural response when we are faced with that kind of story is to want to provide some kind of comfort or some kind of answer, some kind of help and support in the form of, we're going to make this better. Some of these things, you can't make them better. You can only sit with them, and maybe a path, in the end, you have to choose. So a choice will emerge, whether you choose to do nothing and let other people make choices, or whether you choose one or the other, or, to go forward in some way. And so the existentialist would encourage people to make choices and own them, regardless of whether there is a better one or a worse one, or whether we can know this at this point. But as soon as we consciously choose, rather than just let life take over, then we're in charge and we own our life. We own both the things that go well, but also we own the things that don't go well, and that made a huge difference in my life. At some point in my 20s, I decided to take more ownership. Because before, life was just kind of happening to me, and there's a lot of drifters outside there. I describe myself as a kind of a dynamic drifter. I had a direction, and I kind of knew that this positive psychology and coaching thing would probably be something I'll do for the rest of my life. But I had no clue what I was going to do in 1, 2, or 5 years' time. I was just saying yes to opportunities. And it's difficult, and I recognize that firsthand, it's difficult to make decisions, because if they don't work out, it's on you. If you just float, then you just have to be okay with where you end up. But how many people are then in their 40s, 50s, 60s, or 25 nowadays, and they're like, how did I get here? Life just happened to me. And I understand that it's difficult to make decisions because it's on you when they don't work out. It's easier to blame others. But actually it isn't, because it's much easier to own your life and say, I did that. If it worked well or if it didn't, at least it's yours.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So bringing that sense of power back to yourself, really empowering yourself. So that's something you said earlier, I just want to pick up on. Obviously, we're recording this in February 2021. And as you said, we're just coming or re-emerging out of this COVID-19 pandemic. So have you seen, I've seen it described as an awakening. Are you seeing there's a sense of an awakening for people? Are people waking up to some of the, not just in their own lives, some of the challenges we face, but also some of the challenges we've got as a planet? Are you seeing that? Is there an existential awakening, do you think?
I think there's a general existential awakening. I can see that there's a sort of a renaissance for existential thought, which kind of came up in the earlier part of the century, or last century, I should say. But I think any point in time where people are being faced with some of their existential givens is a time where a lot of people, obviously, they have to start thinking. It's impossible not to, because it's in your face. The isolation might be physical rather than philosophical, but like when we're separated from people and we feel that, where do I belong? If we don't see people face to face, it's more difficult to feel that sense of belonging. And also, as you're sitting more with your own thoughts, a lot of people were on furlough, or they had some government support if they were lucky, but nothing much to do. Other people lost their jobs or their industries, so they were sitting there asking themselves big questions. Obviously, there's a huge confrontation with death and endings, which existentialists love to talk about death, but ultimately we're talking about endings and temporality. Things coming to an end happens all the time. And the small endings, ending of a meeting or ending of a job role or ending of a relationship, they might feel big. But if we're faced with the ending of a life, of somebody who we love and who we didn't think was going to die soon, that's got to make you think, And again, some people distract themselves and they just numb the pain. Sometimes it's important that we distract ourselves to just keep functioning for a little while. But it's important to make time to process that. So now we're being faced with isolation and endings and death and a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people ask themselves questions around meaning, not necessarily what's the meaning of my life, but what's the meaning of my job or my career, or how stable are things, or people find their way to God or to spirituality or some other form of helping to answer some questions that are difficult to answer. So in those times, yes, I would say absolutely there's been an awakening, as in any other times of crisis or stagnation or other situations where we're faced with those givens.
Yeah, I know it's been described, and you mentioned it when we were planning this, about the VUCA world, which I personally have a bit of a loathing towards because I don't think it puts people in a good state. But I also see the opportunity for coaches to support people in that. So why don't you talk about what you're seeing around people experiencing on steroids almost, the VUCA world. They're really experiencing it during this period. What are some of your observations and insights around the VUCA world?
Yeah, first of all, VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, which is quite existential. When you've heard me talk about what the existential givens are, a lot of these very much relate to it. At first, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of our life existence, the world, is quite volatile and uncertain and ambiguous and complex. I think if we try to make the world and living seem simple, we're going to run into some walls, and sooner or later, we're not going to see them coming. We're going to drop off a cliff somewhere. Somebody is asking us a question and it's rattling the rock we stand on. And then we might find ourselves in free fall, and we're like talking about the existential resilience. I think if we acknowledge that the world is VUCA, then I think it helps us to have some more open eyes. But then the slippery slope into kind of nihilism begins. As a part of existentialism can lead some people to just throw the meaning out of everything and just say, what's the point? We're all going to die anyway. And this is where the stereotype of the existentialist sitting in a French cafe and smoking gauloise comes from. Like the person who philosophizes about how we're all going to die and life has no meaning. That's where the positive psychology comes in, because I had my positive psychology lens on first before I exposed myself to all of the existential philosophy. So I think it's important to keep it real, have your eyes open, see the world as it is. I know it's difficult these days to talk about what truth is, but there are some objective truths, and we can use philosophy to reveal them. We can use logic. Logic is not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of logic. So you can't really argue with solid logic, at least not with logic. You can argue in different ways. I'm a believer of science and philosophy, and that's how we can find some truth. I think that's definitely an important factor. So if we have that lens on and we look at the world as it presents itself and what it means to be alive in this world, we can acknowledge it and recognize it, but then position ourselves positively towards these kind of facts. I can acknowledge that we cannot prove or disprove the existence of God, and I can decide what I believe, on some of these things until we have some knowledge that might reveal it one or the other way. Any atheist is a believer in there's not a God. So I think that's what Kierkegaard meant when he said, take a leap of faith to bridge the uncertainty of this VUCA world. That's what Sartre was talking about. When you're in the bleakest of meaningless environments, and he was in a Nazi concentration camp, and a few of them, Auschwitz most famously. And in those environments, he could still choose meaning. You can still choose meaning in situations like the pandemic. My colleague Alfred Langley talked about how meaning is always possible. We can always choose that something is meaningful. Through things like mindfulness, for example, that we explored at depth in positive psychology. We can always choose meaning in a particular moment, or we can choose to find meaning in the fact that we're breathing and conscious. The incredibly amazing fact that our body just works and we can keep balance and walk forwards. If we can't walk, then we can breathe. And if we have trouble breathing, we can still form the conscious thought of how we're having trouble breathing. It's amazing what the mind can do. I think we can choose meaning in those times. And I think we can position ourselves towards the VUCA world in a way that helps us to move forward with good spirits rather than despair. In times when we feel despair, it's okay to feel despair. I value my despair days these days because I know they give me a comparison point to when I feel good. Because if I was always happy, then happy would become the new normal, and a little bit happy would become the new happy, and like a little bit happy would become the new sad, and very happy would become the new happy. So we just adjust, and our human ability to adapt to circumstances is a blessing and a curse. Because when things are going well, at some point they're abnormal, and then they need to be better. And they cannot always get better. But when things are going bad, like now, we can also adapt. I feel almost normal in this lockdown right now. I haven't seen any of my friends in ages, but I got used to connecting with them online. And so I think people are amazing like that. So I think there's a lot of choice that we have and a lot of responsibility that we can take when we find ourselves in really difficult situations, and we can position ourselves towards it in a positive way.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I love the way you frame that for people. And as you say, there's always an opportunity to uncover the meaning in something and an experience or a feeling. So let's go towards positive psychology. I know that you've been spending quite a lot of time recently building some content around positive psychology. So I'd like you to frame what for you positive psychology is and who are the people that really influence you in that. And then I'd like you to take us on this journey that you've been on, because I think quite a lot of the people that we've got in the Association for Coaching, they want to create content and they want to grow their organization. And a lot of them have had to adjust to providing things digitally and through Zoom. Lots of people are now on Zoom and Teams and other forms of digital media. And what I love about what you're creating at the moment is you've learned that, yes, live's great, but actually let's have a look at recording content and how can we build a kind of library of content. Let's reel back. Let's start with positive psychology, which is where you really began this journey that you've been on. Who are the people that have really influenced you in positive psychology?
Yeah, so like I said, I fell into positive psychology, so that was just a great fortune for me. Now take more ownership of how I got there, but like the first positive psychology I met was Ilona Bonneville, Dr. Ilona Bonneville, who founded the second masters in the world at the University of East London. And at the time, there was one by Martin Seligman, who I asked Ilona about. I said, hey, Ilona, because she was my undergraduate teacher. I didn't really look into who she was. And I said, hey, Ilona, can you tell me more about this master's program under Seligman in Pennsylvania? And she said, there's another one here, and cohort 2 starts in September. So I had written my dissertation on flow. So Csikszentmihalyi, try to spell that. But if you Google flow and what sounds like Csikszentmihalyi, hint, it starts with CS, you'll find him. Flow has influenced me a lot. Csikszentmihalyi is very old now, so he's not the most engaging speaker, but he did a TED talk about 10 years ago, I think, which is worth watching. Martin Seligman, of course, his book Flourish is probably a really good introduction to well-being theories. Then obviously Ilona Bonneville, she's done a lot of coach training as well. Robert Biswas-Diener is a big name in positive psychology coaching. He was one of the first who wrote about it. Christian van Nieuwenburg, my former colleague at UEL, he's written on positive psychology, so they're publishing quite a bit nowadays. And of course, Susie Green and Stephen Palmer recently wrote, in last year, they published Positive Psychology Coaching in Practice. And that's been the best book around so far. It gives you a really good insight into different ways of applying it. It's an edited version, so there's lots of different authors sharing how you can implement positive psychology into your practice. I also wrote a little ebook, which you can download on my website for free. That's been a course book because I ran a lot of positive psychology coaching training. Well, I call it Positive Psychology for Coaches, because at the time when I created it, it was difficult to say what positive psychology coaching was. It still is, because it's been so new. There's so many different definitions or no solid ones. Really, everybody just does their own way of integrating positive psychology into coaching. So the idea is that you put a lot of positive psychology on the table because it's such a broad range of subjects. And then you let coaches decide what resonates, what might I be able to integrate into the way that I already coach. Because there are some models out there for how to be a positive psychology coach and how to follow a particular methodology or step process. But really, I think when you're a matured coach, you're sitting down with a client and you then have to decide what might be helpful here. And while the questions I ask are informed by my positive psychology lens, I now rarely use a particular methodology unless somebody comes specifically wants to exploring strengths or wants to integrate more mindfulness into the way that they work or create more focus. So there's some ways in which you can apply it in a structured way, but mostly it's a lens that I put on that informs my questions and what I'm curious about. I'm just thinking whether I'm sure there's a lot of people worth mentioning. I think Carol Dweck's Mindset book is fantastic and it's valuable to so many different kind of coaches. And I'll leave it there. I think you have a lot where you can start to explore what positive psychology coaching is and how it spreads.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll make sure that we share a link to your website where you've got your ebooks. I'm sure it covers a lot of some of the foundations and some of the principles that you've shared. So that's really great. And I love the fact that the way that you've shared about the approach that you take to coaching is very much at that sort of masterful level, as I would see it, which is where you're very much in the moment and emergence and see what comes forward rather than there's a framework and I'm going to use this framework. So how do you do that? How did you get from early days in your coaching journey, from using tools, techniques, frameworks to the Yannick that we see or I see right in front of me right now? So how have you got to that point?
It's a great question. And I want to start with saying that anybody who's just starting out as a coach, it's important that we have a structure and clear methodologies that we can follow that can hold us safe, but also hold the client safe. Clients generally feel safer when you say, in session 1, we do this. In session 2, we do this. In session 3, we do this. They're like, oh, I know exactly what I'm buying. This is really clear. And I know what I'm getting myself into. And I have a good understanding of what is likely to come out of it at the end. That's a much easier sell than I'll tailor it to you. And I don't know you yet. So how could I know? And also I work being very present and intuitive. And also in terms of, if we take a Clutterbuckian lens of coaching maturity on this, it's important that in the beginning, we follow models. We follow the GROW model, or we follow Practice or Toolkit or any of the others, Oscar. It helps us to structure the conversation in a particular way because we don't have the experience yet of perhaps just being present and intuitive. We haven't internalized the models and the practices and the techniques, the interventions. We are not so familiar with our bag of tools yet that they just come out at the right time and we can trust that. So it's important in the beginning to have a cheat sheet with the bits of contracting that you want to do at the beginning. That's totally okay. And it's going to help both you and your client. And I guess the answer to your question is already in there because you practice and you coach and you start to internalize. First, you look at your cheat sheet, or you pause with a practice client. You say, hey, let me just check where I go next. Or you say, let me think about my next question for a minute. And the more you look that up and you have that present and you reflect on your practice afterwards and you talk about it with your supervisor, you talk about it with a bunch of peers, you constantly reflect on your practice, you learn more stuff, you do your CPDs, you experiment in things like coaching labs, or SC has a really good way of getting together, seeing some coaching. You just engage in it and you immerse yourself in your practice. And then with time, you will notice how the right question at the right time will just emerge because it's there and you have anchored it. I remember it like it was yesterday, the first time I got out of a coaching session and I reflected on the session. I'm like, oh my God, this was like textbook GROW, even linear. That's super rare. But we talked about the goal and then we talked about reality and then with this and I didn't notice that I was using the GROW model. It just kind of came out because it made sense for this client. There was a particular performance issue that was quite clear and simply structured. I'm like, oh, wow, okay, I guess that's in me now. And you'll notice that when you pay attention to it more and more, that what you learn and then you practice and you reflect on it, you experiment, you take it back to the coaching room, you put it to supervision, you talk about it with some of your peers, maybe you do some further training. And then a couple of months later, you're like, oh my God, this is super in me. But you need to use that stuff. You need to practice as much as possible and not just do CPDs, but actually try it out in practice.
That's fantastic insight and sharing with people that are on the journey, as we all are on the journey and our learning journey. Let's turn our attention to positive psychology and the fact that you're really now, I think you've been doing it for a long time, but you're really bringing together a framework and building a course around positive psychology. So introduce that and share that. And the reason I want you to do that is because I think there's a lot of people that will be at the point where they're anticipating they want to build something like this, but they might be held back. I'd love you to share the story of how you've got to that point and what you've gone on. And then what are some of the things, the aha moments and some of the things that you've explored and experienced as you've built this program?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for providing a platform where I can tell people about this because I'm really quite excited about it. Perhaps I want to reel back a little bit because there's always a journey to when you create content or trainings. So I think often we see the final product that people come out with, and we don't appreciate the kind of journey that was behind it. It started with me talking to a laptop working at the university because there was a growing distance learning program. At some point, the equipment failed that we recorded the lecture. And I just had to talk into a laptop and I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible. I mean, everybody who's created content into a camera on their own will probably know the feeling of, hello, and oh God, that was awful. Hello and welcome. That doesn't sound. It took me like 50 takes to record the first 10 minutes and then it gets easier. But that was 2015 when I started being much more serious about creating content out of necessity, really. And then I realized that there's a lot of responsibility there and there's a lot that I find very meaningful because you're helping people learn and it's part of what I really value at a deep level. And I also noticed that people are invested in these kind of courses and they're invested in learning. And the generative effect that you get from sharing content and value with people who then apply it to other people, who then spread it in their community. The generative effect is fantastic. So that kind of kept my batteries going to do the 31st take. And it gets a lot easier as you do it more and more. So that's how I started to just put some content out. I've always had the idea of doing the social media thing and doing a minute here and a minute there. And like I've been growing my YouTube channel a little bit, but it's mainly just capturing when I've had conversations. Because in the beginning, I thought where I really thrive is conversations. So why not produce content around conversations? Hence our Talking About Coaching podcast and loving this conversation, loving coaching conversations. So I figured let's play to my strength with a positive psychology lens on. and just do the things that I really enjoy doing and cut content from that. That's how I started thinking about content a lot more. So value-based, strength-based, meaning-based. And then at some point I recorded one of the positive psychology weekend trainings and just put that into an online course. So I started thinking a lot more about how do online courses work successfully. And this was my first one, and it broke even. And I realized a good online course is not enough. You also need to be able to tell people about it. You need a lot of either free content from that course that you put out there that people can engage with. And also the other thing I learned is that the majority of people who booked themselves into the course already had an existing relationship with me. So I realized that people buy into online courses regardless of the price, pretty much. If it costs something, they probably want to know you to some extent. And they can get to know you through your social media presence. That is one way of building a relationship. For me, the relationships usually were past trainings or people who I've talked to in the pub or people who were in one of my courses in person or came to one of the talks. People who you've had a conversation with over coffee to catch up. So if you build that kind of relationship with people and then you put an offer out and say, here's something that I care about, and if you also care about it, why don't you check it out? That's when people start buying into your course. So that's the kind of surrounding environment. The content itself was really interesting. There was you mentioned positive psychology course, and a former colleague of mine, Itai Iftzan, former colleague of mine from the University of East London, he then moved to Colorado and started his own school, the School of Positive Transformation. And at some point, I met him again when he visited London, and he told me that he's going to be launching this new course in positive psychology. And he told me about the faculty. And it was basically a who is who of all the most popular researchers in positive psychology. It was like jaw-dropping. Csikszentmihalyi and Seligman are not in there because I don't think that they teach anymore. They're pretty old now. But he had everybody else. It was incredible. From Barbara Fredrickson, who's famous for her positive emotions theory, and Ricard Mathieu, the French monk, a neuroscientist who was the first one who meditated in a CT scanner. Ryan Nemich was teaching strength. Itai is one of the biggest names in meditation and mindfulness and positive psychology, so he was teaching that subject. Sonja Lyubomirsky was teaching happiness. Martin Unger was teaching post-traumatic growth. So they were all there. And I'm like, how did you do that? So he created, the concept of it was that he sends these people a film team wherever they are in the world, and they record 90 minutes of content in 3 sessions. And so you have the biggest name in the field sharing their knowledge. And he picked the ones that were also really good teachers. So it's quite engaging. So I think that's 2 important points, because you have the quality and the depth of the knowledge, but you also have the delivery. And I think they're both important. You know, if you have the most amazing researcher, but they just share their data and they don't know how to communicate it, but they're absolutely brilliant in creating the knowledge, it's not going to be engaging for people in terms of content. So that was important, that you have, that it's easy to digest and that you give enough resources for people to go really into depth, but you don't necessarily force people to become academics, so that the knowledge is based on academia and science and it has good quality and good depth, but you present it in a way that you can still easy to grasp. So not too difficult, not too easy. Yeah, and we initially for this course, that's how we connected. He asked me to create some of the content for him in terms of the interventions. And there's so many tools that we can use from positive psychology that create more well-being in all of its facets. So I've done a lot of kind of course creation, a bit of consultancy for him. And we started running weekly live sessions with me and one of my colleagues as a facilitator. And then at the end of every month, the big name of the module would come and make themselves available for an hour. And I thought, that's absolutely amazing. But one thing we've learned is that over a year of running that course, people didn't actually attend the live sessions. It was about 20% attendance rate. So we've learned a lot from that. And Itai decided that let's give the people what they want, you know, because it's very expensive. He invested so much in creating the best learning experience. And when people are not taking it up, or most people are not taking it up, you change something. So that's why there is now a very flourishing online community where people talk and people exchange stuff. But we don't have the weekly seminars anymore. And we don't expect the big names to make time, because there's a lot of investment. And he dropped the price by 70%. So it worked out well. And that seems to be something that for him and me, it's difficult to grasp, because we both love learning. And we would be there with bells on whenever somebody like Sonja Lyubomirsky is making herself available for an hour, and we can ask her anything. But most people aren't. So with a heavy heart, we're like, do we do a course where we only focus on the ones that absolutely love learning like we did? Or do we make a course that's accessible for as many people as possible so that they can learn about positive psychology. And so that's what we went for, which then freed up a lot of time for another course. And so he asked me whether in the same image, in the same format, I could gather the biggest names in coaching and bring them together for a course in that kind of blended approach. And that's what I've done for the better part of the last 10 months. And we've got an absolutely amazing faculty from David Clutterbuck and Eric DeHaan. Got Sherry Carter-Scott, who did her first coaching session in 1974. She's called the mother of coaching. She's been on Oprah a couple of times. We've got Jonathan Passmore, who publishes every other book. Just the Mastering Coaching, published by the AC, I think, just came out in its 4th edition. So a few of them I knew personally. Others I had the chance to meet. And we just take people through the whole foundation of coaching. And I think one thing that's important that we learned that a lot of people really appreciate is we included more than 20 hours of coaching demonstrations by a whole range of different coaches. The idea is not that here's how you coach. The idea is here's the range of what coaching can be, from quite informative and with a more of a mentoring consulting kind of hat on, offering a lot of things, the kind of more directive approach, and the very facilitative approach, time to think. I talked to Nancy Klein. She's an amazing human being. She couldn't teach because of COVID, and she didn't do any kind of 2-camera teaching. But one of her global faculty, Linda Aspey, is teaching time to think. So we have that range from creating space and time and never interrupt to coaches who are quite direct. And Marshall Goldsmith is one of the coaches who don't teach, but they run a coaching demo. And he talks a lot, while he was coaching in that session. So I like that there's a bandwidth of coaching and that people come in and they get to see a lot of people coach in action, not just talk about it. They get the range of coaching, and then we guide them through a journey of you decide what you integrate into the person that you are, because the person you are is how you're going to be coaching. Who you are is how you coach, is what I often say. So I personally think it's a harder journey because you have to make some decisions and own them in the existential sense. But also, we don't force a dogmatic approach to coaching on you and say, here's coaching and that's how it is. And anybody who coaches differently shouldn't be a coach. So that was very important to me, that we integrate elements of what coaching can be and then make decisions on who you're going to be as a coach.
Wonderful. So I've got a whole series of questions for people that are considering how they do this. First pragmatic one was, how did you enroll these fantastic speakers, leaders in the field into signing up to this?
Yeah, so I've asked them. Fair play. A couple of them I had good relationships with. So through my work at the university, I've known a few people. So there were like 3 or 4 that I knew they were probably going to say yes if I asked them, but you never know. They're super busy individuals. And yeah, I talked to a lot of people. So once I had 3, 4 involved, I then started reaching out to the people that I didn't have a connection with. Where I could get an introduction, I asked for it, but most of them, I just emailed them. I found out how to contact them, and I wrote them a nice personal email and said, here's what we care about. If you also care about the next generation of coaches, it's a overcrowded, it gets to be an overcrowded market, and a lot of coach training is not very good. They will know that as good as I am. We're trying to create this, at a relatively low price point, but with a lot of quality. And this is our format. And we send you a film team. You don't have to invest much time. You talk about something you're super familiar with anyway. So there probably wouldn't be that much prep involved. Happy to sit down for a brief conversation and tell you a little bit more. And then some people turned us down because they're too busy. Some people I didn't hear back. And a lot of people said, yeah, let's have a conversation.
And fantastic. I think you just answered my second question, which is, in this COVID environment, what was the format you've used? And you've mentioned the film crew. So did you still use the film crew, or did you use, Zoom or other technology?
Yeah, so we started filming before the pandemic really got going. So before lots of countries were in lockdown. So we managed to capture most of what we needed to film before that. That was really helpful. Or we captured it like where we did have to do some essential work. We tried to space it out to times when there's no lockdown. So we managed to film almost all sessions outside of any kind of lockdowns. There was one session where it was still COVID, was still out there, but work was okay. And then we just made sure that the room is big and well ventilated, and the videographer is wearing a mask, and they only really have to be close to the speaker when they attach the mic, and even that could usually be done quite safely. Quite a few of the demos we obviously had to film via Zoom because that would be 2 people being too close together. So we did use Zoom as well. It was a bit of a journey. Sometimes we wanted to have the best sound and the best quality given the Zoom kind of thing. So we experimented a little bit with using external mics and external recording devices. We had some issues with ACs running in the background, like air conditioners, external noise. So there's still a little bit of stuff going on. But we sat down at some point, we were like, do we re-record this? And then we decided it's real, it's Zoom. And if the connection breaks for a moment, how does the coach actually deal with that? It's really nice to see that you don't have a super polished, edited, with sections cut demo. It's a demo that's happening and we're not going to shoot it again. So what's happening is what's happening. And then I get to be fly on the wall in those sessions and then come in after the session and have a conversation with the coach about what was going on through your mind as there was this silence, or why did you ask this question and not another one? Or in relation to what you've been teaching, what was the methodology you used? That sounded like a piece of advice. What was that about?
Yeah, no, and it was wonderful that what you shared, because I think quite often a lot of people struggle with getting started. So I love the fact that you had clarity on what you wanted to do. There's a clear set of principles about who you want to influence and why you want to influence them. And then you just asked. So I think that was really wonderful that you did that. And it sounds like you're using multiple different approaches. Some are higher quality, higher cost, and some are other lower quality, but still effective. So it's great to capture that.
Oh, and plus it's accredited by the AC, I should mention, because you guys been absolutely amazing in helping us secure quality and make sure that we tick all the boxes for people to be able to be set up for accreditation afterwards.
Yeah, no, thanks for that plug. That's wonderful. I wasn't looking for that.
I know.
No, thanks for that, Yannick. Another practical question, because this comes up quite a lot for people, is around what's the community platform that you're using? Have you found the right community platform in order to host the information, the videos, the content that you're curating?
Yeah, I'm mostly detached from anything on the kind of organizational, logistical and running side of things, which is why I was so excited about the project, because it's not my school. I'm hired to create the course and curate it and deliver the opening and the last module. But Itai's running the school. I was so happy that I get to do all the creative stuff and the networking stuff while he's doing all the marketing and selling and advertising. And I had somebody who was dedicated to managing the logistics about sending people film teams and coordinating with the editor, things like that. That was really great. We used Thinkific as a platform, and I think Itai was looking around at different options, and that seems to be the best one. Their forum wasn't great, so we're actually still running on Facebook at the moment because it just seems to be the best option. So a lot of students just create a Facebook account just for that. We wouldn't force anybody to give up any of their data. So part of me is, Facebook, but the group features are great and people get together and it's buzzing. You know, there's another course, the meditation teacher training, has been running for years, and it's just lovely to stick your head in because people engage and they share knowledge and experiences. And it's such a nice community of people who support each other, who are passionate about positive psychology or meditation and soon coaching. So I look forward to that. And if we find a better platform, we will use it. But at the moment, that's where we're at.
No, that's great. I just wanted to get into some of the practicalities. And I love the fact that you've played to your strengths again, Yannick. So living and breathing positive psychology. Let me turn attention just for the sort of final few minutes around organizations and your experience of how can organizations, whether that's a small organization, an entrepreneurial organization, or a large corporate organization, how can they benefit from existentialism, positive existentialism, and positive psychology and coaching? What's your experience of how they can benefit from that?
There's lots of different ways. I think the first thing that came to my mind is the kind of distinction of bottom up and top down. You can influence organizations from leadership downwards, from the decision makers who can create the kind of environment where well-being or meaning or more resilience is possible and it's flourishing by creating the right kind of culture, by putting the people in the right kind of jobs, by hiring the right kind of people based on their values or their strengths. So there's a lot that can be done. I'm only scratching the surface for what people in leadership positions and executive positions can actually do to create better workplaces. Kim Cameron's work around positive leadership is really helpful, and there's lots of kind of practical tools and amazing success stories as well. This is not just theory. This has been stuff that's applied. For many years, we had to just not mention the words positive or psychology when people work with organizations, because that was still frowned upon and there was a lot of resistance. But we know that a happier workforce, managers who experience more meaning in their work, they have better results, they make more money, people stay longer, they take less sick leave, there's better relationships, sales go up. So we know that this positive psychology stuff works. It's a matter of how do we package it and apply it. And for businesses, it has to be simple and easy to grasp. And you need to circumvent the kind of resistance that comes from, oh, that's the woo stuff. Now, and this is why positive psychology is so important, because it gives us hard data. The physicist might say that's not really hard data because it's social science, but it's data, it's science. We get evidence that if you apply this stuff, those kind of things happen in your organization. And that's really helpful. That's the kind of positive psychology leadership. The existential leadership is something I'm super passionate about, because we need existential and particularly positive existential leaders in this 21st century. We live in this VUCA world, and a leader who tries to keep things simple and safe and steady is just not going to survive in this climate. We have to be super agile, and we have to be super adaptable, and we have to walk through our organization with open eyes. We need to stop pretending that we're Superman, according to Nietzsche, and that we've got it all and we know everything. We need to show up vulnerable. Brené Brown's work is really important in that space. We need to show up human, and we need to show people who we are as a person. It's no longer possible to just show up in a suit and put on our leadership role and our leadership mask and then say, I know everything and this is how we're going to do things. Because you need your team on board, you need your people on board, and the new generation craves a sense of meaning in their work. So we have to do things differently. And with social media, and everybody's quite open and transparent nowadays, I think our leaders need to be a lot more transparent too. But that's difficult. So that's, I think, where the existential coaching work starts at the top levels, is how do I show up vulnerable when every fiber of my past being is like, don't make yourself vulnerable, you idiot. Why would you do that? So that there's a shift, particularly in leaders who are already established, not the leaders that are coming up. The new leaders that are coming up, the people who run the successful startups, and they're young and they've made it. And it's a fast-paced space where lots of things happen, sometimes on a daily basis. Whole industries have collapsed. So how do you manage that? And how do you go home when you're responsible and you feel the responsibility of all of those people that, are stakeholders of your decisions? There's really interesting work. Just having somebody where you can be absolutely real and where you can make decisions, somebody who appreciates that there's a lot of dilemma going on, but positions themselves in a positive way towards it. It's not awful. It's actually a very exciting opportunity. Excitement and anxiety, they're two sides of the same coin. So that's the kind of leadership space. There's a lot of things that individuals can do. If your boss has no clue about what they're doing and they're not creating the conditions for meaningful work, you can find meaning in your own work. You can do your own work. You can work with your own coach if they don't finance it. But there's also a lot of stuff available online around creating more meaningful work, or around using your strengths, or doing little interventions at work. There's a lot we can do around creating positive emotions. And while they're not a remedy for some of the deeper systemic issues that might happen in your organization, you can learn skills to be more resilient. If you can't remove yourself from your environment, maybe you can change yourself to have a bit of a thicker skin, or bounce back quicker when, your manager acts out of line or has their own stuff going on and just happens to take it out on you and you feel quite powerless. There's a lot you can do to give yourself some power back. And it's not a remedy for the systemic issues. I don't want to say use positive psychology as this, just do this to make you feel good so that you can keep working. I think we need to address both. We need to work bottom up and top down.
No, Yannick, thank you for that. And I think there's another podcast in here for us, which we'll pick up at another time, around healthy and well-being systems, both within ourselves, interpersonally, and also intrapersonally and organisationally. So I really appreciate that. I just wanted to capture your thoughts on that, because I knew you'd have some great insight and you didn't disappoint. The final thoughts really then for you is, when we look at positive psychology and we're talking about health and well-being, what are some of your final thoughts or hints and tips for people?
There's a lot of evidence-based tools that are worth looking up. There's interventions out there. Some coaches love to use them with their clients as somewhat kind of homework or to do them within sessions. But the Berkeley Center for Greater Good has great interventions. There's a site called positivepsychology.com who has run by a friend of mine, Seth. They have a great blog with lots of free interventions. So that's worth checking out what kind of tools are around. That's the kind of most practical, tangible one. As you mature as a coach, I would encourage you to dig a little bit deeper into positive psychology and see what's there for you, see what resonates and what you might integrate into your practice. Very few people become positive psychology coaches, but every coach can benefit from integrating a bit of positive psychology into their work.
Wonderful. And for people that have been inspired by this conversation and through the wonderful insights that you've shared, and there's lots of them, I think, I'll certainly be listening to this 3 or 4 times. Where can people connect with you?
Yeah, so you can connect with me via rocketsupervision.com or via my main site for coaching, which is existential.coach. Write me an email, 42@existential.coach. I'm always happy to have conversations. You can find me in one of my coaching labs, which I run monthly, Yannick's Coaching Lab. You'll find it as well if you Google it. We'll put the links to the courses in the show notes, I reckon, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll make sure that we provide all those links. Wonderful. Yannick, it's been a wonderful dance and journey, and I've really enjoyed it. And it's been great to get to know you. And thanks for sharing your pearls of wisdom, which there are lots of them. So thanks for your time today.
Likewise, Darren. I feel I should invite you as a guest as well, because I feel there's a lot you can give. You've been talking to all of these amazing people. I would love to explore a little bit what you think, maybe at some point in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks for your time today, Yannick.